The warm glow of twinkling fairy lights wrapped the grand oak beams of the winter hearth, an exclusive restaurant nestled in the heart of Vermont's snowy mountains. It was Christmas Eve, and the ambience inside the restaurant was as luxurious as it was serene. Fine crystal glasses sparkled under soft chandelier lighting, and a gentle hum of conversation floated over the rich scent of roasted chestnuts and truffle-infused delicacies. The evening was in full swing, the room alive with laughter and clinking glasses, when a subtle ripple of whispers disrupted the festive mood. "Barron Trump is here," gasped a waiter, his voice a hushed mixture of shock and apprehension. He hurried back to the kitchen, his pale face betraying his unease. The young man's name had barely been uttered when the imposing figure of Barron Trump entered, flanked by a team of suited security guards. He cut a striking silhouette, tall and poised, his dark coat dusted with falling snow. There was an aura of calm command about him, despite his youth, and his mere presence shifted the room's dynamic. Conversations dropped to murmurs, and heads turned as guests watched him walk toward a reserved table near the large bay window. In the back of the restaurant, head chef Elliot Grayson stood at his station, meticulously plating a dish of seared duck breast. His normally steady hand stilled for a moment as the name reached his ears. His sharp blue eyes darkened, and he muttered under his breath, "Not tonight." Chef asked Sophie, the pastry chef, glancing up from her station. She had never seen Elliot falter, not once in her years of working under him. "I'm not serving him," Elliot said, his tone firm and low, but the words carried the weight of finality. Sophie blinked, confused. "Not serving him? Chef, it's Christmas Eve." "I don't care," Elliot interrupted, setting down his tongs with deliberate precision. His voice remained calm, but his expression was taut with something unspoken. "It's my decision." At that moment, Mark, the sous chef, entered, his face flushed from the heat of the stove and the rush of service. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the sudden tension in the room. "Elliot's refusing to serve Barron Trump," Sophie explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes widened. "What? You can't be serious. Do you know what this could mean for us?" Elliot turned to face his team, his jaw clenched. "I know exactly what it means, Mark. And my answer is still no." Meanwhile, in the dining room, Barron had settled into his seat, his expression calm as he surveyed the room. Outside the window, the snow fell in soft, steady flakes, painting the world in a peaceful white. Yet inside, the tension was palpable. The murmurs of the other diners grew louder, curiosity and confusion evident in their glances toward Barron's table. Thomas, the maitre d', approached cautiously, his professional smile faltering. "Mr. Trump, welcome to the winter hearth. May I take your order?" Barron offered a polite nod. "Thank you. I'd like to start with the seasonal soup, followed by the filet mignon, medium rare." Thomas scribbled down the order, his hands trembling slightly. "Of course, sir," he replied before retreating to the kitchen. "Chef, we have his order," Thomas announced as he entered the kitchen. "We need to." "No," Elliot interrupted, his voice cold and resolute. "We're not serving him." Thomas froze, disbelief etched across his face. "You're refusing?" "Elliot, he's not just any guest. Do you understand who he is?" "I do," Elliot replied, his voice laced with quiet intensity. He wiped his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "And I also understand what it means to follow my conscience." Mark stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "Your conscience? Elliot, this isn't just about you. We've got a full dining room of people watching this unfold. This could ruin us." Elliot's shoulders tensed, and he turned sharply to face Mark. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't thought about the consequences?" "Then why?" Sophie asked softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "Why would you do this for a moment?" Elliot didn't respond. The bustling kitchen seemed to pause as all eyes turned to him. Finally he spoke, his voice low and heavy with emotion. 3 years ago, he began. On another snowy night like this one, my son, Daniel, joined a protest outside the Capitol. He was a kind boy, too kind for this world, maybe. He got caught in the chaos and the violence. Wrong place, wrong time. The room fell silent. Elliot swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. I lost him that night. And while I know Barron Trump wasn't there, every time I hear that name, I can't help but think of the pain his family represents for me. It's a wound I've carried ever since. At his table, Barron glanced at his phone, aware of the growing unease around him. One of his guards leaned in and whispered, "There seems to be an issue with the service." Barron raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "What kind of issue?" The guard hesitated. "It appears the chef has refused to serve you." Barron's brow furrowed slightly, though his composure remained unshaken. Refused? He looked around the room, noting the guests' furtive glances and hushed whispers. Interesting. As the minutes dragged on, Barron decided to take matters into his own hands. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his coat and walked purposefully toward the kitchen. Elliot looked up as Barron entered, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. For a moment, neither man spoke. The hum of the kitchen appliances was the only sound. "Chef Grayson," Barron said, his tone polite but firm. "I understand you've refused to serve me. May I ask why?" Elliot hesitated, his heart pounding. The room seemed to shrink around him as he met Barron's gaze. "It's not personal," he said finally. "You've done nothing wrong. But I can't. I won't." Barron tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I see. If I've offended you in some way, I'd like to know." Elliot's fists clenched at his sides, his voice breaking as he replied, "It's not about you, Barron. It's about what your family represents for me, a loss I can't forgive, a pain I can't forget for the first time." A flicker of understanding crossed Barron's face. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "Truly I am. But holding on to that pain forever, it won't bring your son back." Elliot's breath caught. Something in Barron's words pierced through the wall of grief and anger he had built around himself. He stared at the young man, seeing not a symbol of his pain, but a person, a boy barely older than his own son had been. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men stood facing each other. In Barron's calm blue eyes, Elliot saw no malice, no arrogance, only sincerity. It was a stark contrast to the storm raging within himself. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Barron said quietly. "But maybe, tonight of all nights, we could both find a little peace." Elliot closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he leaned against the counter. The weight of his grief threatened to crush him, but Barron's words lingered, offering a glimmer of hope. Elliot began, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can." Barron offered a small, understanding smile. "Take your time, chef. Healing isn't a race." The kitchen seemed frozen in time as Elliot Grayson leaned heavily against the counter, his breath uneven. Barron Trump stood a few feet away, his composed demeanor unshaken, though a flicker of empathy softened his features. Around them, the kitchen staff watched in silent tension, their gazes darting between the two figures at the heart of an unexpected storm. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't understand, Barron. You can't understand." Barron's brow furrowed, his tone gentle yet unwavering. "Then help me, chef. Explain it to me." Elliot's hand trembled as he reached for a dish towel, his fingers twisting it absently as though searching for something tangible to ground him. He avoided Barron's eyes, staring instead at the polished steel countertop. "My son Daniel," he began, his words faltering as the weight of the memory pressed down on him. "He was my world, the best thing I ever created." Barron remained silent, his posture open, his presence unintrusive. He had learned early in life that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and now was one of those moments. Elliot's voice grew steadier, though it was thick with grief. Daniel was only 17, full of dreams, plans, energy. He loved Christmas, always the first to string up lights, the first to laugh at my ridiculous holiday playlists. A faint, wistful smile flickered across Elliot's face before disappearing, replaced by a shadow of anguish. 3 years ago, he joined a protest. He believed in justice, in fairness. But that night, chaos erupted. He was caught in the middle, and I wasn't there to protect him. The room was deathly quiet. Even the gentle hum of the kitchen's appliances seemed subdued, as though they too were mourning the loss Elliot laid bare. Barron took a slow step forward, his voice measured and sincere. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Chef, but what does that have to do with me?" Elliot's head snapped up, and for the first time his eyes locked onto Barron's. Pain and anger swirled within them. "Your family's name, your legacy, it's a reminder of everything I lost. Every time I see it, hear it, it's like losing Daniel all over again." Barron inhaled deeply, his expression contemplative. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the magnitude of Elliot's pain. "I can't undo the past," he said softly. "But I can stand here now and tell you that I'm not my family. I'm just me, trying to enjoy a meal on Christmas Eve." Elliot's grip on the dish towel tightened, the fabric twisting between his fingers. "It's not fair," he whispered, more to himself than to Barron. "None of it is fair." "No, it isn't," Barron replied, his voice steady yet laced with empathy. "But punishing me won't bring Daniel back." The truth in Barron's words was a knife that cut through Elliot's defenses, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He felt the sharp sting of tears welling in his eyes but blinked them away, unwilling to break down in front of his staff or Barron. "You don't know what it's like," Elliot said, his tone almost accusatory, "to lose a child. To live every day with the weight of that absence." "No, I don't," Barron admitted, his honesty disarming. "But I do know what it's like to carry a name that precedes me, to be judged before I've even spoken. And I know what it's like to feel alone in a room full of people." Elliot studied the young man before him, seeing something he hadn't expected: a quiet strength tempered by vulnerability. For the first time he saw Barron not as a symbol, but as a person. Before Elliot could respond, Sophie, the pastry chef, stepped forward cautiously. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as though she were treading on sacred ground. "Chef," she said, her gaze flicking between Elliot and Barron. Maybe tonight doesn't have to be about pain. Maybe it can be about something more." Elliot turned to her, his expression conflicted. "What do you mean?" Sophie gestured subtly toward the dining room, where the warm glow of the Christmas lights spilled into the kitchen. "It's Christmas Eve, a night for forgiveness, for hope. Isn't that what Daniel would have wanted?" Elliot's breath hitched at the mention of his son. He looked down, his reflection staring back at him from the polished countertop. Sophie's words lingered in the air, weaving their way through the tangled web of his emotions. Barron spoke again, his tone gentle yet firm. "She's right, Chef. Tonight can be different. It can be a step toward healing, not just for you, but for everyone in this room." The room felt charged with possibility, the kind that only comes when people choose vulnerability over pride, connection over division. Elliot closed his eyes, the weight of his grief pressing heavily on his chest. Slowly he exhaled, the breath carrying with it a sliver of the pain he had clung to for so long. When he opened his eyes, they were filled not with anger, but with something softer, perhaps even a glimmer of hope. He turned to Barron, his voice steady but quiet. "I don't know if I can ever truly let go of what I've lost, but maybe I can start tonight." Barron offered a small, understanding smile. "That's all anyone can ask for." Elliot nodded, a decision solidifying in his mind. He turned to his staff, who watched him with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Prepare Mr. Trump's order," he said, his voice firm but no longer cold. "And make sure it's perfect." A ripple of surprise and relief passed through the kitchen. Sophie smiled softly, Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and Thomas hurried to relay the message to the dining room. As the kitchen sprang into action, Elliot approached Barron, who had stepped aside to give the staff room to work. "Thank you," Elliot said, the words carrying the weight of sincerity. "For your patience, for your patience, for your understanding." Barron inclined his head, his expression calm yet warm. "Thank you, Chef, for taking that first step." The tension that had hung over the room like a storm cloud began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. Elliot returned to his station, his movements purposeful as he oversaw the preparation of Barron's meal. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: peace. Out in the dining room, Barron returned to his table. The whispers and furtive glances of the other guests had shifted in tone, curiosity giving way to quiet admiration. As he sat down, his guard leaned in and murmured, "Is everything all right, sir?" Barron nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he looked toward the kitchen. "It will be." The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the world in a hushed stillness. Inside the winter hearth, the air was no longer heavy with tension but alive with the spirit of Christmas. It was a night of forgiveness, of connection, and of hope, a night that, for Elliot and Barron, marked the beginning of something new. The dining room of the winter hearth, bathed in the golden light of the season, hummed with a renewed energy. Conversations picked up once more, albeit in hushed tones, as the tension that had gripped the room began to fade. Guests occasionally glanced toward Barron Trump, seated calmly at his table, and the entrance to the kitchen, where the drama of the evening had unfolded. Behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, Elliot Grayson stood with his arms crossed, watching his team work with precision and care. He still felt the weight of his earlier outburst, but the act of preparing Barron's meal carried a sense of purpose that steadied him. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air as the sous chef basted the filet mignon, its caramelized crust glistening under the warm kitchen lights. Sophie approached Elliot hesitantly, her hands dusted with flour from the freshly baked rolls she had just prepared. "Chef," she began softly, "I just wanted to say, I think you made the right choice." Elliot looked at her, his expression tired but contemplative. "Do you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her gaze earnest. "What you did earlier, it wasn't just about him. It was about you too. Letting go, even just a little, can make all the difference." Elliot exhaled a long, heavy breath that seemed to release something deep within him. Maybe he said quietly, "But I'm not sure I deserve that kind of grace." "None of us do," Sophie replied with a small smile. "That's why it's so powerful." Her words lingered in Elliot's mind as he turned his attention back to the meal. He watched as Mark plated the dish with meticulous care, the fillet resting atop a bed of creamy mashed potatoes, flanked by sautéed green beans and a drizzle of red wine reduction. It was a simple yet elegant plate, one that Elliot would have been proud to serve under any other circumstances. When the dish was ready, Thomas appeared at the pass, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "I'll deliver it myself," he said, his voice steady. Elliot nodded, stepping aside to let Thomas take the plate. He watched as the maitre d' carried it out to the dining room, the swinging doors briefly revealing a glimpse of the festive atmosphere beyond. Elliot couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety, wondering how Barron would receive the meal and what it might mean for the fragile truce they had established. At his table, Barron sat with his hands folded, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful. He had spent much of his young life under scrutiny, but tonight's events had felt different, more personal. He glanced up as Thomas approached, the plate balanced carefully in his hands. "Mr. Trump," Thomas said, placing the dish in front of him with a practiced flourish. "Your filet mignon. On behalf of the winter hearth, we hope you enjoy your meal." Barron looked up at the maitre d', offering a polite nod. "Thank you, Thomas. And please, thank Chef Grayson and the team for me." Thomas hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by Barron's gracious demeanor. "Of course, sir," he replied, retreating toward the kitchen with a newfound respect for the young man. As Barron picked up his fork and knife, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. A few guests watched him out of the corners of their eyes, curious to see how he would react, but Barron paid them no mind, his focus on the meal before him. He cut into the fillet, the knife gliding effortlessly through the perfectly cooked meat, and took a bite. The flavors were rich and harmonious, a testament to the skill and care that had gone into its preparation. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curving upward in quiet appreciation. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to relax, savoring the moment. It wasn't just the meal that brought him comfort, but the knowledge that something meaningful had been set in motion, something that extended far beyond the confines of the restaurant. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Elliot stood by the pass, his arms crossed as he waited for any sign of how the meal had been received. When Thomas returned, his expression unreadable, Elliot felt his stomach knot. "Well," he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Thomas smiled, a small but genuine expression that immediately eased the tension in the room. "He's enjoying it," he said simply, "and he asked me to thank you." Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though the weight of the evening still lingered. "Good," he said quietly. "That's good." But even as the kitchen returned to its rhythm, Elliot found himself retreating to a quieter corner, his thoughts a jumble of conflicting emotions. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, his hands gripping the edge as he stared down at the floor. The memory of Daniel's laughter, his bright eyes and boundless energy, played in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. "I'm sorry, Daniel," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I hope you'd understand." As the evening wore on, the dining room gradually emptied, the guests departing with contented smiles and holiday wishes. Barron remained at his table, sipping from a glass of sparkling water as he gazed out the window. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape, and the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflected off the frosted panes. Thomas approached cautiously, clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Mr. Trump, is there anything else I can get for you?" Barron shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No, thank you, Thomas. I'm all set." He paused, then added, "But if Chef Grayson has a moment, I'd like to speak with him." Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the kitchen. "I'll let him know," he said, his tone careful. When he relayed the request to Elliot, the chef's initial reaction was one of reluctance. What more could he possibly want? Elliot muttered, his tone laced with fatigue. "He seems sincere," Thomas replied. "I think. He just wants to talk." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. The idea of facing Barron again filled him with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. But something in Thomas's expression, perhaps the quiet respect he had shown earlier, pushed Elliot to nod in agreement. "All right," he said. "I'll go." Elliot stepped into the dining room, his presence commanding but subdued. Barron stood as the chef approached, extending a hand in a gesture of respect. "Chef Grayson," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you for coming." Elliot hesitated briefly before shaking Barron's hand. "Mr. Trump," he replied, his tone measured. They sat across from each other at the table, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Barron was the first to break the silence. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his gaze sincere. "Not just for the meal, but for everything tonight. It couldn't have been easy for you." Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't," he admitted. "But I owed it to myself and to you to try." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can't pretend to understand your pain, Chef. But I do know that carrying it alone, it can consume you." Elliot looked away, his jaw tightening. "It already has," he said quietly. "For years, I've let it define me. And tonight, I realize just how much I've let it control my life." Barron leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "Then maybe tonight can be the start of something new. A step toward healing." Elliot met Barron's gaze, the young man's words resonating deeply. He saw in Barron not just a symbol of the past, but a glimmer of hope for the future. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a small but significant change that felt like the first breath of fresh air after a long storm. "I hope you're right," Elliot said, his voice soft but resolute. "I hope you're right." As the two men shook hands once more, the dining room of the winter hearth felt transformed, not by its decorations or its cuisine, but by the simple act of connection. And as the clock struck midnight, Marking the arrival of Christmas Day, the spirit of forgiveness and renewal lingered in the air, promising brighter days ahead. The winter hearth lay still in the quiet aftermath of Christmas Eve's dinner service. Snow gently blanketed the Vermont mountains, muffling the world in a serene silence that stood in stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had passed through the restaurant hours before. The last of the guests had departed, leaving the dining room dimly lit by the soft glow of its Christmas decorations. Inside the kitchen, the staff was busy with the final tasks of the evening, their movements methodical but tinged with the quiet relief of a service completed. Chef Elliot Grayson stood alone near the back exit, leaning against the cold steel of a prep counter. His hands, calloused from years of work, clutched a steaming mug of black coffee. The night had left him emotionally drained, his thoughts swirling like the snow outside. Despite the exhaustion, there was a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years, a strange, unfamiliar sensation that might have been hope. Chef Sophie's voice broke the silence, pulling Elliot from his thoughts. She approached cautiously, holding a small plate covered in foil. "I saved you a piece of the chocolate torte. Thought you could use something sweet after tonight." Elliot glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thanks, Sophie. You didn't have to." She shrugged, her expression kind. "I wanted to. It's Christmas, after all." Elliot nodded, taking the plate from her and setting it on the counter. For a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with the unspoken weight of the evening. "You handled it well," Sophie said finally, her tone gentle. "Better than I expected." Elliot huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know about that." "No, really," Sophie insisted, her eyes earnest. "You didn't just cook for him, you faced something you've been running from. That takes courage." Elliot looked down at his coffee, the steam curling upward like a question mark. Maybe he murmured, "But it doesn't feel like enough." Sophie stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It's a start, Chef, and sometimes that's all we need." Elliot let her words settle over him like a warm blanket. He nodded slowly, offering her a quiet thank you before she returned to the kitchen. He stood there for a while longer, sipping his coffee and staring out the frosted window. The memory of Barron's calm, steady gaze lingered in his mind, a reminder of the unexpected connection they had shared. Meanwhile, Barron Trump sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, its engine humming quietly as it navigated the snow-covered roads leading to his hotel. The interior was warm, but Barron barely noticed, his thoughts consumed by the events of the night. He leaned his head against the cold window, watching the snowflakes swirl in the glow of the passing streetlights. James, his lead security guard, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Quiet night, sir?" he asked, his tone light but respectful. Barron turned his gaze toward James, his expression thoughtful. "Not exactly," he replied. "It was different." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He had worked for the Trump family long enough to recognize when Barron needed space to process his thoughts. The young man was different from the rest of his family, quieter, more introspective. It was one of the reasons James had always respected him. After a long silence, Barron spoke again. "Have you ever met someone who reminded you of a part of yourself you didn't even know was there?" James considered the question as he navigated a turn. "Can't say I have, sir, but it sounds like quite an experience." Barron nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window. It was. Back at the winter hearth, Elliot was wrapping up his night when Thomas approached him, holding an envelope in his hand. "Chef," he said, his tone hesitant. "This was left at the front desk. It's addressed to you." Elliot frowned, taking the envelope. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unfamiliar. He opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of stationery inside. As his eyes scanned the page, his breath caught. "Dear Chef Grayson, thank you for tonight. I know it wasn't easy, but it meant more than you realize. Your courage to face your pain and take that first step is inspiring. I hope, in time, you'll find the peace you deserve." Wishing you a Merry Christmas. Barron Trump. Elliot read the note twice, his hands trembling slightly. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed against his chest. He folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, holding it tightly as though it were a lifeline. For the first time in years, he felt a crack in the armor of his grief, a small opening through which the light of something new could shine. For years, Chef Elliot Grayson had carried a burden so heavy it shaped every aspect of his life, a grief that hardened him, isolated him, and turned his passion for cooking into a mechanical routine. The memory of his son Daniel, tragically lost in a moment of chaos, haunted him. Each day, Elliot buried himself in the kitchen, believing that pain was his penance. His interactions with others were guarded, his emotions locked away behind an impenetrable wall. But Christmas Eve brought an unexpected confrontation, not with another person, but with his own heart. When Barron Trump entered the winter hearth, Elliot's refusal to serve him wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a manifestation of the unresolved anger and sadness that consumed him. Yet, in Barron's calm demeanor and sincere attempts to connect, Elliot saw something he hadn't felt in years: understanding. The note Barron left for Elliot, simple yet profound, touched a part of him that he thought was beyond reach. For the first time in years, Elliot felt the faintest flicker of hope, a possibility that he might someday step out of the shadow of his loss and rediscover the joy he once knew. Yet questions linger. Can Elliot truly let go of his grief? Will his newfound connection with Barron become a catalyst for change, or will it simply be a fleeting moment of comfort? What happens next in this journey of healing and redemption? Will Elliot embrace the chance to rebuild his life, or will his past continue to hold him captive? Comment 2 if you're eager to see how this story unfolds. Let us know your thoughts. What do you think lies ahead for Chef Elliot and Barron? Share your predictions below. The next morning, Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the snow sparkling under the soft winter sun. Elliot arrived at the restaurant early, the empty dining room filled with the golden glow of sunlight streaming through the windows. He carried a small box with him, his steps deliberate as he made his way to the corner of the room, where a framed photograph of Daniel rested on a side table. The photo was one of his favorites, a candid shot of Daniel laughing, his face alight with joy as he held a soccer ball. Elliot placed the box on the table and carefully opened it, revealing a single ornament, a small silver angel with outstretched wings. He hung it on the Christmas tree that stood nearby, the delicate ornament catching the morning light. "Merry Christmas, Daniel," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I miss you." He stood there for a long moment, letting the silence envelop him. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked into the kitchen. There was work to be done, and for the first time in years, Elliot felt ready to face it, not as a man weighed down by grief, but as someone beginning to heal. Later that day, Barron returned to the winter hearth, this time without his usual entourage. He stepped through the doors alone, a small wrapped package in his hands. The dining room was empty, save for Elliot, who was arranging chairs and tidying up from the previous night. When Elliot looked up and saw Barron, his surprise was evident. "Mr. Trump," he said, setting down the chair he was holding. "What are you doing here?" Barron smiled faintly, holding up the package. "I wanted to bring you something. A small thank you." Elliot hesitated, then nodded, gesturing for Barron to join him. They sat at a corner table, the air between them warmer than it had been the night before. Barron placed the package on the table and slid it toward Elliot. "Go ahead," Barron said. "Open it." Elliot unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal with a simple gold clasp. He ran his fingers over the smooth cover, his expression a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. "I thought you might need a place to write things down," Barron said. "Sometimes putting it on paper helps." Elliot looked at Barron, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means a lot." Barron nodded, his own expression reflective. "You gave me something last night too, Chef. A reminder that we're all carrying something, and that we're stronger when we face it together. For the rest of the morning, the two men talked about grief, about hope, and about the unexpected connections that can change a person's life. By the time Barron left, the dining room felt brighter, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the warmth of their conversation. As the door closed behind Barron, Elliot looked down at the journal in his hands. He opened it to the first page, where a single sentence had been written in Barron's neat handwriting. The first step is always the hardest, but it's also the most important. Elliot smiled, a quiet determination settling over him. He picked up a pen from the table and began to write. As Christmas morning sunlight streamed through the frosted windows of the winter hearth, Chef Elliot Grayson stood in the quiet kitchen. He held Barron Trump's note in his hand, rereading the words as though trying to absorb their meaning fully. The night before had shaken something loose within him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But there it was, staring at him in black and white, a reminder that courage wasn't about perfection, it was about taking the first step. The kitchen, usually bustling with energy, now felt like a sanctuary. The stillness gave Elliot room to think, and for once he allowed himself to reflect. His fingers grazed the edges of the letter as his thoughts drifted back to Daniel, the bright, laughing boy who had once filled this season with joy. "What would you say if you were here, Daniel?" Elliot murmured aloud, his voice breaking the silence. In the corner, Sophie appeared, her arrival as quiet as the snow falling outside. She carried a tray of freshly brewed coffee, her expression thoughtful. "Morning, Chef," she said gently, placing the tray on the counter. Elliot gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. "Morning, Sophie." She hesitated before speaking again. "Didn't think I'd see you here so early, especially after last night." Elliot smiled faintly. "I couldn't sleep. Too much. On my mind." Sophie studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the letter in his hand. That from Barron. Elliot glanced at the paper, then nodded. "It is. He wrote this after everything." "What does it say?" she asked, her tone curious but gentle. Elliot hesitated before handing her the letter. Sophie read it slowly, her brow furrowing slightly as she absorbed its content. When she finished, she looked up at Elliot, her eyes soft. "He's right, you know. It took courage to face him and yourself." Elliot shrugged, his expression conflicted. It didn't feel like courage at the time. It felt like survival. Sophie smiled faintly. Maybe they're the same thing. As the day unfolded, Elliot found himself moving with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The winter hearth was closed for the holiday, but he had invited his staff to join him for a quiet Christmas lunch, a small gesture of gratitude for their hard work throughout the year. The dining room, still adorned with twinkling lights and garlands, seemed warmer, more inviting than it had the night before. When the staff began to arrive, the atmosphere was a mixture of festive cheer and quiet reflection. Mark, the sous chef, carried a bottle of wine, grinning as he placed it on the table. "Figured we could use this," he said, his tone light. Thomas, the maitre d', arrived shortly after, holding a tray of homemade cookies. "My wife insisted," he explained, setting them down with a chuckle. "Said it wasn't Christmas without them." As the group settled in, Elliot moved between the kitchen and dining room, preparing simple dishes that felt personal rather than extravagant. There were no cameras, no critics, just the quiet hum of conversation and laughter as his team shared stories and memories. It was during one of these moments that the front door opened, the cold air rushing in as Barron Trump stepped inside. He was alone, his coat dusted with snow. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him, their surprise evident. Elliot was the first to speak. "Mr. Trump," he said, stepping forward, "what are you doing here?" Barron smiled faintly, his posture relaxed. "I was in the area," he replied. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing." Elliot hesitated, then gestured toward the table. "Join us. We're just having a quiet lunch." Barron nodded, shedding his coat and taking a seat. The initial tension in the room eased as the conversation resumed, albeit with a new layer of curiosity. Barron, for his part, seemed content to listen, occasionally offering a thoughtful comment or a polite question. It wasn't until the plates had been cleared and the wine nearly finished that Barron turned to Elliot, his expression serious. "Chef, may I ask you something?" Elliot nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Of course." "What's next for you?" Barron's question was simple, but it carried an unexpected weight. Elliot paused, the question catching him off guard. Next he repeated, as though the concept were foreign to him. Barron nodded. "You've taken the first step, but where does it lead? What do you want to do with it?" The room grew quiet again, the staff subtly watching their exchange. Elliot considered the question, his gaze drifting toward the Christmas tree in the corner. The silver angel ornament he had placed there that morning caught the light, its presence both comforting and bittersweet. "I don't know," Elliot admitted finally. "For so long I've been stuck just surviving, like Sophie said. I've never thought about what comes after." Barron leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "Then maybe it's time to start." Over the following weeks, Barron's words lingered in Elliot's mind, becoming a quiet refrain that guided his actions. The winter hearth continued to operate as usual, but Elliot began to see his work through a different lens. He started to notice the small, human moments, the laughter of a couple sharing dessert, the delight on a child's face as they tried something new. These were the things he had taken for granted, the things Daniel would have loved. It was during one of these reflective moments that an idea began to take shape. Elliot stood in the kitchen, his hands dusted with flour, as he prepared a batch of freshly baked rolls. The memory of Daniel's laughter echoed in his mind, mingling with the warmth of the moment. "What if this place could be more?" he murmured aloud. Sophie, who had been slicing vegetables nearby, looked up. "More how?" Elliot set down the dough, his expression thoughtful. "More than just a restaurant. A place where people can connect, share their stories. A place where no one feels alone." Sophie smiled, her eyes lighting up. "I think Daniel would have liked that." Elliot nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I think he would have, too." As the idea grew, so did Elliot's determination to make it a reality. He began to host monthly community dinners, inviting people from all walks of life to share a meal. The dining room was rearranged to accommodate long communal tables, and the menu featured simple, comforting dishes that reflected the season. Barron became a frequent guest, often showing up unannounced to lend a hand in the kitchen or sit with the guests. His presence brought a quiet sense of reassurance, a reminder that even the most unexpected connections could lead to something meaningful. One evening, as the first community dinner came to a close, Elliot stood at the head of the table, looking out at the room filled with laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, not because his grief had disappeared, but because he had found a way to channel it into something that mattered. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Thank you for being here tonight. This is just the beginning." As the guests applauded, Elliot glanced at Barron, who offered him a small, encouraging nod. In that moment, Elliot knew he wasn't alone, that he had found not only a purpose but also a community. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that brighter days were still ahead. The snow had begun to melt by the time the winter hearth's next community dinner approached, leaving the Vermont mountains framed by patches of evergreen and glistening frost. Inside the restaurant, Elliot Grayson moved with quiet purpose, preparing for an evening that had quickly become the heart of his renewed vision. He no longer thought of the dining room as merely a place to serve meals. It was now a space where lives intertwined, where stories were shared, and where healing found fertile ground. The long tables had been carefully arranged in the center of the dining room, covered with white linens and decorated with modest arrangements of winter greenery. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the savory aroma of braised beef and rosemary. Candles flickered in their holders, casting a warm glow that softened the room's elegant lines. Elliot paused by the window, gazing out at the soft twilight as guests began to arrive. The hum of conversation grew as coats were hung and hands were shaken. He allowed himself a small smile. These nights had become something he looked forward to, a rare space where he could feel Daniel's presence not in the ache of loss, but in the joy of connection. "Chef, we're ready to start," Sophie said softly, approaching with a clipboard in hand. She had taken to organizing the dinners with the same care she put into her desserts, her passion for the project clear. Elliot nodded. "Thanks, Sophie. Let's make tonight special." As the dinner unfolded, the room buzzed with warmth and camaraderie. Guests, many of whom had been strangers when they arrived, laughed and talked like old friends. Elliot moved among the tables, checking on the food and occasionally stopping to join a conversation. He found himself drawn to a small group at the far end of the room, a retired teacher, a young single mother, and a man who had recently lost his wife. Their stories wove together with a depth that left him both humbled and inspired. Chef Grayson, the retired teacher, said, turning to him as he approached, "You've created something remarkable here. It's rare to feel this kind of connection anymore." Elliot smiled, his gratitude genuine. "Thank you. It's the people who make it what it is." The teacher nodded thoughtfully. "Still, it takes a spark to start a fire." Barron Trump arrived halfway through the dinner, his presence as understated as ever. He slipped in quietly, exchanging a few polite greetings as he made his way to the kitchen. Elliot noticed him immediately and excused himself from the table. "Barron," Elliot said, meeting him at the door. "I wasn't sure you'd make it tonight." Barron shrugged lightly, his expression calm but warm. "I wouldn't miss it." Besides, he added with a faint smile, "I heard there's a shortage of dishwashers tonight." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "We might be able to find a place for you." Barron spent the rest of the evening helping where he could, refilling water glasses, carrying plates to the kitchen, and even stepping in to assist Sophie with desserts. His quiet humility didn't go unnoticed, and by the end of the night, the staff and guests alike regarded him with a genuine fondness. After the dinner had concluded and the last guests had departed, Elliot and Barron found themselves alone in the dining room. The candles had burned low, their warm light giving the room an almost dreamlike quality. Elliot poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Barron, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming tonight," Elliot said, his tone sincere. "It means a lot." Barron nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Me?" Barron set his cup down, his gaze thoughtful. "You showed me something I didn't expect to find here, something I didn't even know I needed. You taught me that healing isn't just about letting go, it's about finding something worth holding on to." Elliot's throat tightened at the younger man's words. He had spent so long consumed by his own pain that he hadn't considered how his journey might resonate with someone else. Barron, Elliot began, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever stop missing Daniel, but these dinners, they've given me a way to honor him, to keep his memory alive." Barron nodded, his expression soft. "And you're giving that gift to everyone who walks through these doors." The 2 men sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling between them like a shared understanding. When Barron finally rose to leave, he extended his hand. Elliot took it, the handshake firm and filled with a mutual respect that needed no words. Over the following months, the winter hearth became a beacon in the community. Word spread about the monthly dinners, drawing people from nearby towns and even farther afield. Each dinner brought new faces and new stories, but the heart of the event remained the same: connection, understanding, and hope. Elliot found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The once gruff chef who had built walls around his grief now welcomed vulnerability, both in himself and in others. He began to see his kitchen not just as a place of work, but as a space where lives could be transformed. Barron continued to be a regular presence, often bringing ideas or small tokens to contribute to the dinners. One evening, he arrived with a framed photograph of a community garden he had helped establish in New York. He placed it on the mantel in the dining room, explaining how the garden had become a place of renewal for its visitors. "Maybe we could start something like this here," he suggested, his tone casual but hopeful. Elliot studied the photograph, his mind already spinning with possibilities. "I think Daniel would have loved it," he said quietly. As the seasons changed and winter gave way to spring, the winter hearth grew into more than a restaurant. It became a symbol of what could happen when pain was met with compassion, when loss was met with love, and when one man's courage to take the first step inspired others to do the same. And in the corner of the dining room, the silver angel continued to gleam, a quiet reminder of the past and a beacon for the future. The air at the winter hearth was crisp with the promise of spring, the scent of budding flowers drifting through the open windows. Inside the kitchen, Chef Elliot Grayson worked with practiced ease, his hands moving instinctively as he prepped for the evening's dinner service. Yet, his mind wasn't entirely on the task at hand. Instead, his thoughts lingered on a newspaper headline he'd seen earlier that morning. "Trump family prepares for upcoming election cycle." Elliot paused, the knife in his hand hovering over a bundle of fresh rosemary. The words stirred something in him, an unexpected sense of loyalty and gratitude. It wasn't a feeling he had anticipated, not after all the years he had spent distancing himself from anything remotely connected to that name. But Barron Trump had changed that. The quiet young man had become a fixture in Elliot's life, showing up at the winter hearth with his calm demeanor and genuine willingness to help. Barron's actions had proven to Elliot that the weight of a name didn't define the heart behind it. And now, as the Trump family prepared for the next election, Elliot felt a pull he couldn't ignore. That evening, as the last of the guests departed, Barron lingered in the dining room, helping Sophie stack chairs and tidy up. Elliot watched him from the kitchen, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was something remarkable about Barron, something quiet yet profound. He wasn't just a guest or a volunteer, he had become a friend, a confidant, and in many ways a catalyst for Elliot's transformation. "Barron," Elliot called, stepping into the dining room. "Got a minute?" Barron straightened, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeves. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Elliot gestured toward the corner booth, where they often sat after the dinners to share coffee and conversation. As they settled into the familiar space, Elliot leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I saw the news this morning," Elliot began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "About your family gearing up for the next election." Barron's expression shifted slightly, a mix of curiosity and caution. "And what did you think?" Elliot hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I thought about you, about everything you've done for this place, for me. You've shown me a side of your family that I never would have seen otherwise." Barron met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Chef?" Elliot took a deep breath, the weight of his decision pressing on him. "I'm saying I want to help. If there's anything I can do to support you or your family, I'm in." For a moment, Barron said nothing, his blue eyes studying Elliot with quiet intensity. Then, a small smile broke across his face, one of genuine warmth. "That means a lot, Elliot, more than you know." The decision wasn't one Elliot made lightly. Over the next few weeks, he found himself navigating a new world, one filled with campaign rallies, strategy meetings, and conversations about policy and vision. It was a stark departure from the sanctuary of his kitchen, but it felt like a natural extension of the journey he had started months ago. His involvement began modestly attending local events, sharing his story with small groups of voters, but it quickly grew. Elliot's authenticity and passion resonated with people, drawing them in and reminding them of the power of personal connection. When he spoke about Barron, his words were filled with genuine admiration. Barron Trump isn't just a name or a title, Elliot told a gathering of local business owners. He's someone who listens, who shows up, who makes you believe that change is possible not through power, but through kindness. The crowd responded with applause, their energy feeding into Elliot's newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that could make a real difference. One evening, after a particularly lively town hall event, Barron found Elliot sitting on the steps of the venue, a cup of coffee in his hands. The night was cool, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. "Penny for your thoughts?" Barron asked, taking a seat beside him. Elliot chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I was just thinking about how far I've come. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be here speaking at rallies, supporting a campaign, I'd have called you crazy." Barron smiled, his tone light but sincere. "Life has a funny way of surprising us." Elliot turned to him, his expression earnest. "It's because of you, Barron. You didn't just change my mind about your family, you changed my life." Barron looked down, a hint of humility in his demeanor. "I didn't do anything special, Chef. I just believed in you." As the campaign gained momentum, Elliot's role continued to evolve. He became a trusted voice in the community, his reputation as a chef and restaurateur lending him credibility and relatability. His story of loss, redemption, and the unexpected bond he had formed with Barron became a powerful narrative that resonated with voters. At one event, Elliot stood on a small stage, a microphone in his hand. The crowd before him was a mix of ages and backgrounds, their faces lit with anticipation. "I used to think that my pain defined me," Elliot began, his voice steady but emotional. "I thought that losing my son meant losing myself. But then I met someone who showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something new." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Barron Trump didn't just teach me that he lived it. And because of him, I'm standing here today telling you that change is possible, hope is possible, and we all have a part to play in making it real." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. In the front row, Barron stood quietly, his hands tucked into his pockets, a small but proud smile on his face. As election day drew closer, Elliot found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The winter hearth remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer the sole focus of his life. He had discovered a new purpose, one that extended beyond the walls of his restaurant and into the hearts of the people he met. Late one evening, after a long day of campaigning, Elliot returned to the winter hearth. The restaurant was empty, its tables and chairs neatly arranged for the next day's service. He walked to the corner where Daniel's photograph still rested, the silver angel ornament hanging nearby. "Daniel," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish you could see this. I wish you could meet Barron, see what he's done not just for me, but for so many people." He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "I miss you every day, but I think I'm finally doing something you'd be proud of." On the night of the election results, the Winter Hearth hosted a private gathering for close friends and campaign supporters. The air was electric with anticipation, the room filled with laughter, conversation, and the occasional nervous glance at the television screens mounted on the walls. Elliot stood behind the bar, pouring glasses of champagne for the guests. He felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. When the results were finally announced, the room erupted into cheers. Barron, standing near the center of the room, was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. But even in the midst of the celebration, he sought out Elliot, weaving through the crowd to find him. "You did it," Elliot said, his voice filled with pride. Barron shook his head, his expression humble. "We did it." They clinked glasses, their smiles reflecting the shared journey that had brought them to this moment. And as the celebration continued, Elliot allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope, not just for himself, but for the future they were building together. What a journey this story has taken us on, a journey of healing, forgiveness, and the power of human connection. From Chef Elliot Grayson's grief-stricken heart to Barron Trump's quiet determination to make a difference, we've seen how even the most unexpected relationships can ignite profound change. This isn't just a story about loss or redemption, it's a story about the courage to take the first step, the strength to open your heart, and the impact one person can have on another's life. Elliot's transformation, inspired by Barron's kindness and humility, reminds us that no matter how heavy our burdens, there's always a way forward. Together, they showed us the beauty of turning pain into purpose and the magic of shared humanity. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to be part of its ripple effect. Hit the like button to show your support, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, uplift, and bring us closer together. Share this video with your friends and loved ones. It could be the spark they need to find hope in their own lives. We'd also love to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Which part resonated most with your own experiences? Drop your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We read and cherish every one of them. Let's keep this conversation going and spread the message of love, understanding, and hope. Together we can make a difference.